After nearly 2 years of war, the US and NATO have provided nearly $200 billion in aid to Ukraine but are now preparing to concede. According to a report from TASS, cited by Reference News on December 3, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, in an interview with a German television station on the 2nd, admitted that they couldn't meet Ukraine's ammunition needs. He also mentioned preparing for bad news from Ukraine. What does this mean? Isn't the NATO Secretary-General directly telling Ukraine that they're out of ammunition and should prepare to surrender? What's really going on here? In this video, we'll discuss the NATO Secretary-General conceding on behalf of the US and cover the following topics: NATO abandoning Ukraine, sacrificing Ukraine, Israel's conspiracy revealed, Putin preparing for a major conflict, China guarding against a US sneak attack. In truth, the situation isn't that complicated. The US faces a more critical situation elsewhere, a place they absolutely must intervene to sustain their global hegemony. To support Israel, after the outbreak of conflict between Israel and Palestine, the US swiftly redirected the ammunition aid meant for Ukraine to Israel. There are three fundamental reasons behind the US actions. Firstly, Israel evidently holds more importance than Ukraine. Secondly, Ukraine has already shown signs of being stuck in a quagmire of war. And thirdly, the US genuinely doesn't have as much ammunition available. In other words, the US fundamentally can't support two proxy wars simultaneously and has to consider a choice between the two. Therefore, the recent statement by the NATO Secretary-General is essentially a concession on behalf of the US. The biggest loser in this US concession is, of course, the Ukrainian government. On December 2, when asked if there were concerns about the situation in Ukraine deteriorating, Stoltenberg replied, "We should also prepare for bad news. Wars evolve in phases. But in good times and bad, we must support Ukraine." Even though they clearly know bad news is coming and still say they must support Ukraine. If there's no ammunition, doesn't that mean the support is gone? Is Ukraine supposed to confront Russian planes and artillery with empty promises from the West? The NATO Secretary-General isn't even offering suggestions to the Ukrainian government now. He said it should be difficult decisions made by the Ukrainian people. Let's not forget, initially, when Ukraine wanted to negotiate with Russia, NATO basically instructed people to assassinate those advocating for talks with Russia. And now, they're simply disregarding it, deciding on their own. In reality, the US and NATO had long wanted Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. The advice from former US Secretary of State Kissinger before his death was for Ukraine to abandon the territories already occupied by Russia, and then Russia would agree to Ukraine joining NATO. Clearly, Putin wouldn't agree, and ultimately, talks didn't happen. So, what about now? It's likely the US's condition isn't about Ukraine joining NATO anymore. It's more about Russia refraining from advancing, and the US agreeing to that. But how could Zelensky's government easily accept such a demand from the US? So, the result must be seen on the battlefield. It's within this logic that the NATO Secretary-General mentioned preparing for bad news from Ukraine. In the Israel-Palestine conflict, who is the biggest winner? At least for now, undoubtedly, it's Putin, it's Russia. Because with the outbreak of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the US had to shift its attention, and the pressure on Russia drastically decreased. In this context, Putin has already begun preparing for a major breakthrough in Ukraine militarily. Sacrificing Ukraine, Israel's conspiracy unveiled. Who could have thought that sacrificing Ukraine was actually part of Israel's plot? Yet, after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel began contemplating how to benefit from this conflict. According to the New York Times, Israel knew about Hamas's attack plans more than a year ago. The report stated that based on a series of documents, emails, and interviews obtained by the media, Israel had received a Hamas operational plan over a year ago, but Israeli military and intelligence officials deemed the plan unrealistic, saying they believed Hamas would find it too difficult to implement. The Israeli Defense Forces and Israel's National Security Agency declined to comment on the disclosure. Initially, we all thought Hamas's attack this time was flawless. However, upon closer consideration, Hamas dispatched over 1,500 individuals for the raid, all clearly a suicide squad prepared for sacrifice. They swiftly attacked Israel using gliders and motorcycles. So, with such large-scale training and Israel's tight surveillance network, how could they possibly have had no inkling of this? If Israel knew, why not fortify defenses? In fact, it now appears that it wasn't a lack of defense but rather a strategic ploy to invade Gaza. This so-called lack of defense preparation was actually a ruse, a pretext to occupy not only Gaza but the entirety of Palestine. Israel even entertained the idea of leveraging U.S. power to invade Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. These were all part of its plan. When Hamas launched the attack, it fell right into Israel's hands. But how does this relate to the Russia-Ukraine conflict? It's closely tied. The outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict means Russia will be tied down in Ukraine. If the U.S. couldn't handle 2 proxy wars, Russia certainly can't handle 2 full-fledged wars. Therefore, Israel can confidently conduct military operations in Gaza without worrying about interference from Russian troops stationed in Syria. For Israel, as long as Russia refrains from interference and the U.S. supports them, they can secure time for their military actions in Gaza and potentially occupy it entirely. Otherwise, if there were no Russia-Ukraine conflict and Russia declared its intention to join the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel would have to back off because the U.S. wouldn't engage in direct conflict with Russia for Israel's sake. So, for Israel, the greatest risk of not fully occupying Gaza lies in the presence of Russian troops in Syria. Meanwhile, when we consider that Zelensky is Jewish, it's quite suspicious. Could it be that Zelensky had a mission to provoke the Russia-Ukraine conflict, aiming to sacrifice Ukraine for Israel's gain? This logic is truly chilling upon careful consideration. Putin preparing for potential conflict. In the backdrop of the prolonged Israel-Palestine conflict, Russian President Putin has made 2 significant decisions. Firstly, a 70% increase in military spending by 2024, a considerable figure for economically strained Russia. Without specific plans, why the sudden need for such a substantial increase in military spending? Let's not forget, in 2022, with nearly a year of Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russian military spending increased by only 9.2%. This is definitely an unusual signal. Secondly, a presidential decree signed by Putin on November 29 stated the need to expand the military due to Ukraine's special military operation and escalating threats from NATO, aiming to increase the overall Russian military force by about 1.7 million to 22 million. Among them, military personnel would account for 1.32 million. This marks another military expansion announced by Putin since August 2022. Some analyses suggest this expansion is due to significant depletion of troops on the Russia-Ukraine battlefield, forcing Russia to expand its military. However, these assumptions are misguided. Note that Russia is expanding its overall army size. If it were merely troop depletion, they could directly replenish personnel without expanding the overall army. Expanding the overall army size means adding 170,000 personnel. On one hand, significantly increasing military spending. On the other hand, undertaking large-scale military expansion. What is Putin aiming for? The target seems quite clear: Ukraine is squarely in the crosshairs. Clearly, Russia has not abandoned its objectives of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine within its special military operation. Undoubtedly, as the Israel-Palestine conflict prolongs, the U.S. can no longer focus on Ukraine. This provides Russia with the ideal opportunity to achieve its ultimate goals, and Putin wouldn't miss out on that chance. Moreover, Putin envisions the possibility of a global outbreak of either a world war or a new Cold War. In such a context, Russia may confront the entire NATO. Hence, increasing troop numbers in advance favors their future confrontation. Indeed, Putin's actions aren't baseless. The total military force of EU countries is approximately 1.91 million, while NATO countries total around 3.5 million troops, with the US contributing 1.46 million. This implies that the combined force of the US troops in Europe and those from other NATO countries amounts to 2.1 million. Russia hopes to swiftly surpass this scale, gaining an advantage in future confrontations with NATO. On one hand, this is to expand gains in Ukraine. On the other, it's a precautionary measure. China must guard against U.S. surprise attacks. Why do we say we must guard against potential U.S. surprise attacks? We must never forget that China is the ultimate target, the primary objective for the United States. The U.S. dreams of toppling China and has continuously sought ways to incite military conflicts around China's periphery, aiming to entangle China in war. Why should the US be content while Russia, Europe, and others are mired in conflict while China remains unscathed? The US isn't willing to accept this reality. They aspire to disrupt. The Korean Peninsula, the South China Sea, South Asia, all are areas the US wants to provoke. The US even has intentions to establish a foothold in Central Asia. China must be exceptionally cautious. Why? Because if Russia further expands its military actions in Ukraine, ultimately forcing Ukraine to entirely lean toward Russia, and if Russia and the US/NATO reach a compromise and understanding, it implies a US-Russia compromise. If the US and Russia compromise, Islamic countries won't unite to oppose Israel anymore. With the US containing Islamic nations, the Israel-Palestine conflict might reach a stable deadlock, freeing up the US to focus on China. At that point, military conflicts could erupt around China's periphery, disrupting China's overall development. Therefore, do not be reckless just because the current situation seems unfavorable to the US. On the contrary, circumstances can change drastically, and a localized reversal of the situation is entirely possible. To preempt such a possibility, China needs to strategize and plan. It must staunchly avoid being caught off guard by the US. This is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We genuinely appreciate your support.